All right, everybody. So, hi, I'm Kynetta McFarlane. I'm a clinical psychologist and the owner of Transformative Health, where I provide trauma-informed and affirming therapy. So, the culture of poverty. I've been doing a presentation on the culture of poverty for many years. I've always worked in community mental health. I've always been like really interested in like working with like underserved and under-resourced communities. It comes from my background of being a Girl Scout and having a crazy Girl Scout mother. So one of the things that I'm very clear about though, when I like give this presentation, I talk about this, is that I'm clear that I didn't grow up in the culture of poverty, that isn't like my life experience. And I came up with this training based off of like biases that I saw in myself, but then also biases that I saw in others when I was doing supervision and consultation. And just also like why some of the strategies that we were coming up with may not really fit with our clients and our population. So before we get into this, I think it's really like important for us to understand what poverty is, and as a social justice person, why just like all these ideas like make my head explode. So in terms of what, according to the government, is poverty, is as a single adult, it is making less than $12,880. As a family of four, it would be making less than $26,500. So according to the government, if you make less than this, you're considered in poverty. I don't know what grocery stores you've been in, if you've been looking at the price of gas. To me, this is very much too low of a threshold for us to really think about what is in poverty. And so that's like one of the biggest things that I want us to recognize. Often when I'm giving these talks, I recognize that I often have people that are in the room that I would say are likely living in poverty. Because when I got like all into my nerd stuff, and I went online and I looked up like what is the average price like of a house. And I figured out what like the yearly salary of an individual who makes $12 an hour. Now, Ohio's minimum wage is $9.30. So this is above Ohio's $9, right? So if I made $12 an hour and I worked full time and I lived in a 700 square foot apartment, my weekly income, my rent would be 42% of what I make in a week. Now, I'm not smart enough to figure out like taxes and stuff. So it's probably even higher than that because that's just me doing gross, like, money based off of like the average. So I really want us to understand that when we're often talking about poverty, this is how low of the threshold is, and that this threshold is likely too low, that a lot of people that are in poverty are not considered in poverty. And I also want us to be aware of the amount of people that we work with that also may be having some of these challenges. So other things that we know about poverty is that you're more likely, if your parents are single parents versus married, you're more likely to be in poverty. 1 in 6 children are in poverty. And then when we look at, when I looked up information specifically about Ohio, 780 children right now in Ohio are houseless. So these are children in Ohio schools that currently do not have a home. So over 30,000 children in our schools are like without homes. In terms of poverty, 14% of seniors are in poverty. Deep poverty is looking at the poverty statistics and having that number in half, and then you earn below that. About 5% of the United States is in deep poverty, and about 11% of Americans deal with food insecurity. So that's not being able to have enough food to be able to know like where your next meal is going to be or whether or not you can fully eat. And out of that 11% that are food insecure, half of those people receive food assistance. So even with receiving food assistance, they still have difficulties having like full meals and knowing where their next meal is coming from. So some more about the implications of poverty. We know that single parents households have more poverty. More people in poverty live in the South. In the past, rural poverty at one point was higher, urban poverty at one point was higher. Now they're about equal. I already explained to you and I showed you just in terms of for housing, how often the more poor you are, the more expensive things are for you because they take a higher percentage of your paycheck. So when I looked at somebody who was $12 an hour, their housing was 42% of their paycheck. When you look at somebody who's $14 an hour, it's still ridiculous, but it goes to 27% of your paycheck. So when you have a lower income, you spend significantly more of your overall money for your housing needs, your transportation needs, and your food needs. Families that are in poverty are 50% more likely to move within a year. And so us thinking about like stability and like mental health development for children, we can see how that isn't like the best situation for a family to be in. And the other thing about families in poverty, they're 3 times as likely to rent versus own. And so one of the things that people often think about people in poverty is that they're not employed or not fully employed, but 50% of low income children and 30% of poor children have a parent employed full time. Now, if you're a child and you never grew up in poverty, you have a 5% chance of being in poverty in your 20s versus being in poverty for 8 to 14 years. Your chance goes up to a 40% chance in being in poverty. And so we see that the more years that you're in poverty, the more likely that you are to stay in poverty. This slide just goes over some information in terms of for Ohio in 2020 and looked at the houseless rate and looked at the poverty rate in terms of in Ohio. So in terms of for overall, we ranked 36 out of the 50 states. In terms of for children, 36, the number of children under 18 who are below the poverty level. In terms of working age women, we rank 39th, and for working age men, we rank 33rd. So when I name this, I name this the culture of poverty. And so one of the things we need to think about is, what is culture? And so culture is a belief system. It's a belief system and a value orientation that influences customs, norms, and practices. Culture also influences, what do we do socially? What do our educational, our schools look like? And what is our expectation of somebody who goes through those different institutions? Culture also takes into consideration our psychological processes. And so when I'm talking about that, I mean, how do we problem solve? How do we use our language? What's our memory like? And how do we take care of each other? Culture is also influenced by the media. So by the media, I have certain ideas about what's acceptable or what's not acceptable and what things should or should not look like. So when we talk about the culture of poverty, we're talking about the extent to which an individual does without resources. Now, when most people think of poverty, they're thinking about poverty as a lack of money. But poverty is really due to a lack of resources. And out of all of these listed resources, money is often not the most important. And we all can have probably seen this in terms of, we all know like childhood celebrities that we grew up watching that had all these millions of dollars and now are broke. So just the having of money doesn't mean that you can keep money, and just having money isn't at all the most important thing. So when we talk about these resources, we have lots of different like categories. We have financial. So that's what most people think about poverty in terms of like money and access to goods. But we also have emotional. How are you able to deal with difficult emotions and situations? How are you able to persist in terms of hardship? Mental and cognitive. How do you access like information? What are your like skills like reading, writing, computer skills? And how do you deal with everyday problems and challenges? Spiritual. Do you have a purpose for living? Do you have a future outlook? Do you feel like you have guidance? In terms of physical, do you have a well-working, able body that makes you feel self-sufficient? In terms of support systems, do you have outside resources, friends or families that you can get help for when you're in a time of need? Relationships, do you have appropriate role models that are not destructive and that are showing you adaptive ways of how to handle problems and situations? Hidden rules. Hidden rules are those unspoken rules that let other people know that they don't fit in without you really having to say anything. And then language and formal register is having the vocabulary and language skills to be successful in work and in school. So one of the things that I often see in terms of when people are talking about poverty or talking about individuals who live in poverty or for generationally have lived in poverty: lazy, uneducated, resistant, loud, unruly, and unappreciative. These are just some of the biases that I've heard from people when they talk about individuals who have less resources. And part of this is going back to what we talked about in terms of the culture part. People in poverty have a different culture than often the culture that many of us right now in this room are working from. Most of us, in terms of the culture of work and the culture of US society, is based off of middle class rules. If you're in poverty, you just have different rules. It doesn't mean that your rules are better or worse. It just means that the way that you do things is differently. The same thing for me in terms of like being an African American. People of African descent are louder naturally than people of European descent. So I will go into places outside of my ADHD and be louder than some of my friends that I'm with. I don't think that that makes my loudness negative. It just makes it different. But it is very noticeable that I am different from others. And often what people are noticing is that people in poverty have a different culture than middle class culture, and we judge them about having that difference in terms of appreciating it. So now what? Because I've just thrown a little bit of info at you because we only have like so much time, but I want us to get our brains working, and I want us to be thinking about like, how do we talk about people in poverty? How do we look at like their behaviors? How are we judging them? So the first thing that I ask everybody to do is to check your bias, is to recognize that even if you grew up in poverty, a lot of these like belief systems that we have about people in poverty, you may have them too, because they're associated with American culture. This belief system of just by pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, you'll be successful. as I was able to show you, the more years in poverty that you are, the harder it is for you to get out of poverty. So just pulling yourself up by the bootstraps does not work for everybody. So we really need to like check our bias in terms of like recognizing that people in poverty just have a different way of doing anything. The other thing is to learn more information. I do a full training on the culture of poverty through the Center of Innovative Practices. And so if you would like that and some free CEUs, I would suggest that you check out that training, because I can't get all that into this 15 minutes. But the biggest overall thing in terms of like what we find is the most important in terms of working with people in poverty is working on the relationship. And that's a very trauma-informed thing, because often people in poverty have experienced way more trauma than any of us here, right? So one of the things that's so important in terms of if you are working with an individual in poverty is to make sure that you have a real and authentic relationship. Thank you so much for your attention.